Well, welcome to Good Business Pays Television, where, as you know, we interview organisations and people who have been involved in paying fast, paying their suppliers fast, and in particular have won Fast Payer Awards. And today we're going to be talking about the Natwest Group, and we're lucky to have with us John Hayes, who for the last, I think, 8 years or so has been Chief Procurement Officer for the Natwest Group, and in no small part would have had a lot to do with them winning these awards and paying fast. So we're very lucky to have you here, John, with us. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
Now, I know first point really is Natwest Group. I know you all quite well because we work together quite closely, but a lot of people won't realise the size and scope of it. Can you tell us a bit about the organisation, please?
Yeah, so it is. So obviously, most people will probably recognise it publicly as Royal Bank of Scotland from a few years ago. That tended to be the public face. More recently, became Natwest, and as you say, we're a UK-focused major bank these days. Big focus areas around business banking, corporate banking. As well as personal retail banking as well. So we still remain a large bank in the UK with a significant customer base, and we're either number 1, 2, or 3 in each of those segments. So we still retain quite a bit of size and diversity as an organisation.
And your role as Chief Procurement Officer, what does that actually mean? And tell us about your journey as well, because you've had a number of roles in the organisation.
Yeah, so I've been with the organisation for over 21 years. And I've had a variety of different roles since 2002, when I came in actually as a team leader within Green Flag, which was or still is a breakdown organisation that was at the time part of the Royal Bank of Scotland group. So I've had a variety of roles, moving from there into Direct Line Group, then into what we called the main bank at the time, round about the time of the 2008 crash. And at that point was moving into more of a facilities and property space, just about at the time that post 2008, there were a number of conditions set as a result of state aid that was provided at the time, that we had to dispose of quite a few businesses. So at that stage, Direct Line, for example, WorldPay, were all exited from the group. So I had some involvement with those exit programs before I then moved into a group head of facilities role, which I was in that role for 4 or 5 years before being then lucky enough to move into this procurement role, or supply chain as is referred to within the bank, but externally a bit more commonly known as a Chief Procurement Officer role. And as you say, I've been doing this role for 7 or 8 years now. And in terms of our own supply chain, it's much more consolidated than it used to be, but we're still spending in the order of £3.5 billion a year with about 4,000 suppliers. And roughly 1 in every 2 pounds is with a third party. So suppliers are completely integral to the success of the bank. So the bank couldn't succeed without a good supply chain. That's just a statement of fact.
And when you came in to, I guess, take on the procurement role after leaving your other functions, what was it like? Was it very different to today in terms of supply relationships, payment times, or have you had to change a lot? Or
yeah, so it was different at the time for because our role aligns very much to the bank's strategy overall. So you can almost map the department's approach according to the bank's 5-year plans that were in place. So at that point in time, we'd moved out from basically a survival phase sort of after 2008, where the bank very nearly went bust. So there was 4 or 5 years of survival. Then there was 4 or 5 years of stabilization before we then entered the phase we're now in, which is more around growth and purpose. overall. So when I came into this job, we were in that middle phase, which is more around stabilization overall. And at that point, the relationship with the suppliers was much more focused around sort of cost, unit cost, quite a lot of consolidation of the supply chain, etc. So it was a much more price focused conversation than it probably is today, where it's a much more two-way partnership conversation, where suppliers are important to our journey as well, rather than just something that is supports the bank. Actually, there's a two-way process there, but between us and our suppliers.
And what happened? What was the change point where somebody said, maybe it was you, maybe it was somebody else, you moved from a price point with a supplier to a position where you see suppliers being a key part of your strategy, and we need to change the relationship with them? What was the catalyst for that change?
So I don't think there was any sort of day where it was decided we'd move. It was really I would say the big catalyst was Alison Rose coming into her role as chief executive, and she set a very clear strategy around purpose and defined us as a bank really in terms of the success of others and our role in facilitating that. So that's quite a change from how most people saw banks in the past, where banks themselves were the success and the profit center, to actually now our success is measured through other people's success. So that was a significant change when she came into the role. That then sort of legitimized a focus around actually supporting suppliers much more, not just on payments, but also understanding more from a carbon perspective, modern slavery, etc., etc. So that sort of legitimized, I would say, a conversation that had already started, certainly within the supply chain team in the years before that. Prompt payment was always something that was valued within the team. So from that perspective, it wasn't new. But what it probably didn't have at that point was almost the organizational effort behind it to say we recognize it as a good thing. It was more recognized as a good thing by individuals who took it forward. So it wasn't necessarily it sort of changed overnight. It was a journey they were on that then became legitimized through the strategy.
And what did that mean for your role and the work you had to do to, I guess, start a culture change at that point across the organization?
Yeah, so I mean, if I'm honest, it's always been something that's been important to me personally, and I think that's actually quite an important success factor overall. Is you do need someone who's actually prepared to lean in on this, not because they've been told to, but because they want to overall. So it's always been something for me that's important. What it then meant, though, is it made the conversation much easier with those that perhaps weren't in that position. So to say, actually, it is now part, it's not just my strategy, it's part of the bank strategy overall. So it made the naysayers who maybe didn't see it as a priority, it made it easier to then give them data, ask them to act on that data, and start to make a significant improvement. And that's what we've done over the years, and now we're in a really positive place. And some of our businesses who weren't in a positive place are now in a really good place. Is there anything in it for them? No, other than having satisfied suppliers overall, and can point towards how they support the bank strategy overall. So yeah, in many ways, it made my job a little bit easier, I would say.
And fast forwarding to sort of now in a different world, do you think the naysayers or executives in general across the business see the value beyond just being nice to suppliers of this strategy?
Yeah, they do. And again, there's another just factual reason for that, which is behind the cultural change as well. So, you know, we won't be unique, but we often talk about being one bank. Lots of firms will talk about a similar cultural approach of being one firm. So we talk about one bank. Now, what that means for me and in this context is a lot of our suppliers are also the bank's customers. So that there's a sort of a 360 relationship here around actually we're often financing our suppliers because they're our customers, and then those customers are then providing service to us as a supplier. So that there is a sort of holistic ecosystem for us that makes it therefore worthwhile ensuring we treat suppliers fairly, because in many cases they're our customers as well. And you know, that back to front relationship or front to back relationship probably wasn't as properly recognized in the past as it is now. So that again, that sort of brings the whole story together in many cases.
So, I mean, we talk quite a lot about payment culture at Good Business Pays, and Natwest Group were amongst the first of our Fast Payer Awards. We're now into year 3. And when we did our year 1 analysis of the 100 fastest payers, one of the things we found was that the leaders of the organizations, in particular the CEO and the CFO, and it's my thought, it's a personal thought, that the CFO is quite often heavily involved in the policy or the strategy around payment times. Sometimes the CEO, not always, but those two people are quite important in that. That when we looked across the 100 fast payers, 97 of them had CEO and CFO that had a tenure of more than 20 years in those organizations, not in those roles, but in the organization itself. And I was interested to sort of wonder about whether being around in a company and really knowing its market, its purpose, its customers, the ecosystem played into being able to make bold decisions about supplier payments. It's easier to say yes when you really know the value of them. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think that's a good point. And you know, when I saw that statistic from Good Business Pays, it's not, if I'm honest, it's not something I'd thought about before, but when I saw the statistic, it did make me have a think about, so what is it that makes longevity a difference? And I guess probably the answer for me, which is sort of a personal one, would be I think it's also maybe reflective of the time it takes to implement these sorts of cultural change programs. So it does take time to start to say what you want to do and then see that all the way through a process to the point where it becomes embedded into the culture. You know, that can take, you know, years and years to do. So I can see how, if you've therefore got your senior leaders, CEO, CFO, in place for a long period, then they're also therefore invested in that long journey overall. It's very hard to make culture change in a short period of time. So if you were more a transient CEO, my guess would be cultural change in a short period of time is much harder. So I don't know whether what I've said is factually correct overall, but I can see from our own journey that these aren't quick things to improve. So you really need people who are going to be with you and prepared to lean in throughout that whole journey, rather than sort of just take shorter term decisions and then move roles.
And how easy is it? How easy is your job now? I would say, right, in the sense of you've got many different organisations, you hold them to account for how they treat suppliers and how fast they pay. I think you do quite a lot of block and tackling still in the organisation to make sure that still happens. Is it as easy as it sounds?
It's easier, and the reason it's easier is it is embedded. So it has its own momentum now, which doesn't rely on, you know, one or two people with a real passion for it making it happen. So I think that from that perspective, it makes it easier overall. It still needs monitoring, you know, and you know, if behavior does slip back, it is something you need to sort of jump on quite quickly. We also report, because we report by legal entity, and like many corporates will have lots of legal entities. So we do report up to the board, all of the legal entities. So that does give a degree of pressure to those who can see their name maybe lower in the list than they would like, as well, to start to improve it, because ultimately, as an organization, we're using pretty much the same processes and systems. So if someone is faster or slower than somebody else, it must be the people in there which are, you know, the difference. So no one can say, yeah, because it's because we use that system and they use that system, or they process invoices in that way and we do it in that way. It's a consistent approach across the whole organization. So there is nowhere really to hide on that, you know, anymore. So it is easier, you know, than it certainly was a few years ago. And again, it's made easier by the fact that we're in a positive place. It's embedded, and once you're there, it's quite hard to become poor, if that makes sense. You know, if it's now the norm, we'd have to do quite a lot to go backwards. Is my feeling on it. Sometimes you vary a little bit. You know, we can go up or down by a day over a sort of a 6-month period, but something would have to seriously go wrong now for us to go significantly back into, you know, tens of days. And for us, actually, just to sort of put a level around it, so our average days to pay across all our organizations is 6 days.
Yeah.
And the spread across the legal entities is between sort of 4 and 7 overall. So we're averaging 6, and 97%, over 97% of our invoices are paid in 30 days overall. So, you know, that for me demonstrates, given the volume of invoices, because we're dealing with hundreds of thousands, that actually it's now embedded into the organization.
Yeah. We often talk, Good Business Pays, about the will and the way, and it feels like you've got to have both in place to be able to make all this stuff work.
Yeah, I agree, and often when I'm talking to Liz Barclay, the Small Business Commissioner, that's, you know, when we're sort of looking at what's made the difference, it's not just process and systems alone that do it. You still need the will behind it to deal with the exceptions that pop out of the system, etc. So yeah, you need all of those things in one place. Just a good process and system would only get you so far, is my view. You need people who actually believe it's the right thing to do, so that when it goes wrong, they prioritize fixing it very quickly. And things do go wrong. I mean, you know, that is life. Things will go wrong. It's the speed at which people then address it, I think, is important.
And we like you said about the number of days, for instance, not changing very much over time. We see that in most commercial organizations, that whether they pay slow or fast or somewhere in the middle, their payment performance doesn't really change that much over the years when you look at it over a period of time, unless something happens, and then it changes by the tens of the days. Do you and I've Good Business Pays, we've just released a report called Who Cares, which is all about companies that hit the buffers, that went bust, and where we saw them getting worse and worse over time before effectively they flew into the sea, and we pulled the black box out afterwards and then say what happened around payment times. And we can see events linked to when payment performance got worse. Just to sort of, I know it's not a scientific question, but you mentioned a day or two either side. But how many days do you reckon it would take if you saw a change on a chart where you think, hang on, something rocky's going on there?
Well, I mean, so I report it within my every team, every department in probably every organization has their own success measures that they probably look at on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. So it's data I review monthly, and it's reported for us into our risk committee, so it's seen as a key risk indicator for us. The reason it's reported there is because we see it as a sign of health of the supply chain. So that's where the risk lens comes on it. So yeah, I review it monthly. You could do it quicker than that, but I'm not sure you would get much value from it overall. I don't think you would see any of the sort of trend data. So monthly seems about right, and then we do a more of a formal review every 6 months with 6 months worth of data. So we're just finalising a H1 review for 2023 as well. So the monitoring of it is quite closely reported, and when we review it monthly, that isn't just within my team. That's where it originates. That data then goes out to each of the business areas as well, so they have the same visibility of their own performance on it, so it can drive any action, which might be a blocker. It might be some invoices that are outstanding, and sometimes you just have to step in on some of these sorts of things. But I mean, you'll get sometimes massively minor issues hold up sort of big invoices. I mean, I've seen invoices sort of sitting unpaid in the past because there's a sort of a 50p discrepancy between what you were expecting to pay and what you got invoiced, and these are invoices that are hundreds of thousands of pounds. So you sometimes there has to be a bit of common sense and pragmatism applied, which says, let's just push it through and pay it and then sort it out afterwards, as opposed to down tools on the whole thing while we try and reconcile 50p out of it. So again, so reviewing the data just enables you, if you needed to step in like that.
And you've, if I remember rightly, you've introduced something which I think is quite unusual around the supplier charter. I know you changed the name of the sort of agreement you have with suppliers to reflect not only your commitment, but the suppliers as well. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so like many organizations, most organizations probably have a supplier code of conduct. So, that's a document which basically says, here's what we expect from our suppliers. Natwest had a code of conduct. Lots of organizations have a code of conduct. So that bit isn't particularly new or unusual. In 2021, we changed that from a code of conduct to a supplier charter, and that the real change in that was the change of emphasis, and again aligned to the bank's purpose-led strategy overall, which is I always describe the old code of conduct more like the 10 Commandments. So what it really was a list of thou shalts to suppliers. What it didn't really say was, but what about us as a host organization? What are we going to do? So it felt very much like, we're going to sort of lecture you around what you should do. Don't look too closely at what we do, because that's not important. So it didn't really feel like a sort of a role modeling approach as an organization. So the key change in the charter was to balance it, really. So the charter starts with, how will NatWest be overall, and then it says, because we're like that, we expect you to be like that as well. So it's very much based in, we're not going to ask any supplier to do anything we wouldn't do ourselves, because that would feel unfair to do that. So it's intended to be much more balanced overall. So in terms of payment performance, we obviously set out our expectations, and increasingly what we're now getting into is understanding the payment performance of our suppliers as well. And there are one or two times where we have actually, quite often based on data from Good Business Pays, actually we have stepped in with a supplier who we can see either being a late or a slow payer, just to start to ask some questions around why that might be. We've not ceased a relationship because of that, but we sort of feel that's part of our job to sort of help everybody that you're trying to help, is just to actually start to ask some of those questions that perhaps are not so forthcoming when perhaps you ask, or small business office ask or something like that. So that's very much what the charter's meant to do. It's meant to be, we'll lead by example rather than just lecture others.
Terrific. And NatWest was one of the first supporters of Good Business Pays when we started. Why do you think the work that we do, Good Business Pays, is important? And what do you think we should try to achieve in the next 2 or 3 years?
I mean, it feels like a statement to the obvious, saying why it's important. But it's important that there is a healthy ecosystem between suppliers and customers, and paying suppliers on time is a vital part of that, and there is no reason why it shouldn't be done either. So I think it's important work fundamentally, to keep the whole supply chain fit and healthy. What Good Business Pays particularly gives us, which is why we support it quite closely, is it gives us sort of usable data, usable, reviewable data that we can have a look how others are doing, either our suppliers or our peers, etc. So whilst we submit data as part of our legislative requirement on prompt payment, it's not necessarily the easiest to sort of navigate an outcome. It feels very much like a process. So if you want to then get something back out of it, it can be quite tough on that. Whereas we feel with Good Business Pays actually gives us very usable data and very good advocacy as well. And I think the balance as well between it's not just all about shaming the poor performers. I think that's important. I think it's also important to understand why the good performers are good, because I don't think necessarily everybody who's not doing so well sets out to not do well. There are probably, from conversations I've had, quite often reasons why they are the way they are. Some of those were exposed during COVID, where you got into sort of extreme scenarios of sort of cash flow protection and all those sorts of things. So I'd like to think no organization sits there and says we are deliberately going to be slow. I suspect some maybe do, but so maybe I'm being a bit half glass full, but I think most probably just struggle to, for one reason or another. So I think the sort of shared learning case study aspect to it, I find really useful as well.
I think it feels like, and thank you for that commitment that you've given us and NatWest has given us. We couldn't have done it without you for sure. But it does feel a little bit like the question of how important is it to an organization. You mentioned earlier on in our chat that this work, and maybe it's not the easiest work, it takes time to change this culture, it takes time to embed this stuff, and sometimes it's easier to go with something flashy that makes you look good today, whereas the stuff that we do around suppliers and payment is not always in the shop window, but it really is one of the foundation stones of a good business. I describe it as how businesses behave when others aren't looking.
Yeah,
it does feel like that. And if you can do that well, then you've really got an organization with a strong purpose.
That's true. Yeah. It's what people say about you when you're not around, isn't it?
We are lucky to be talking to you in the last few weeks of your 21 years with this organization, and I hope actually that your organization will put this interview in not only into the archive, but also to share it with colleagues so they can see why this stuff is important after you've gone. But what's your proudest achievement in your 21 years with the group, would you say?
What's my proudest? So I have a lot of them really. I think so. Topics like this, and there's quite a lot of adjacent topics, I would say. So prompt payment, starting to measure scope 3 carbon emissions, modern slavery. So this whole sort of topic around you and your supply chain doing the right thing, not just be seen to be, but actually doing the right thing. That is certainly in the financial services sector. I think others are probably different, but in the financial service sector, that is quite a new topic area. It's not one I would say banks have progressed that much, because they just don't necessarily feel like they have to. We're not manufacturers overall, so our job mainly is to move money around. So I don't think it's been a topic. So I would say one of the things that's probably made me most proud as I sort of leave NatWest is actually what I leave behind, which is actually all of these things are now an integral part of the process. And for me, this is a sort of sign of success of any leader. It's when you go, does everything carry on, or does it all just collapse like a deck of cards overall? And I'm super confident that it will carry on as it is. We now have a good balance in our tendering processes, where it's not just about risk, service, and cost. It's now also about sustainability as well, which for us, that broad topic area would include payments of suppliers. So I think for me that certainly makes me very proud, because it's a new topic. It's quite complex. It's quite difficult to influence, and for many procurement teams, it's not always a skill set which has been grown within the team as well. So you've got to help support people and train people, as well as incentivizing them, etc. So I think for me that makes me sort of most proud, that you sort of feel you've made a bit of difference actually to get an embedded culture in place around that. Loads to do. I always say this when I talk to others. I'm certainly not leaving saying, great job done. All I've really done is put some foundation blocks in place for now many more years of work that needs to be done. So I don't think you'll ever get to a point where you say it's finished, but what I feel is the path is set overall.
Yeah, I can see that. And the bit that probably we don't think about as much is that all of those changes you've introduced will have helped thousands of businesses and suppliers to grow and change and achieve things that they couldn't have done had they worked with a different culture around them. So that's a sort of hidden thing we'll never be able to measure, but we know it's there, and that's the important thing.
I agree.
A couple of forward-looking questions before we finish, John. So I know that you have been part of looking at the changes in payment regulations. You've been called in by the great and the good at Westminster for your views on that. Now we are talking in early June 2023, so we're expecting in the next 4 weeks to see what the government is recommending in terms of changes. What changes, if any, do you think or hope might be in there?
So I look at lots of these things. The bit that always sort of shocks me in this, before you get on to what needs to change, is almost why what you've got today isn't working in all cases. So I don't think necessarily there needs to be much of a legislative change. There's always improvements you can make, and they should be made. The bit for me I would like to see is those that should be reporting and should be doing better actually report, and as a consequence will start to do better. As I've said to you before, I can't remember where I read it, but I certainly have read that only something like 50% of the firms that should report publicly their payment performance do. Now, the reason that surprised me is because it is a requirement to do it, and we treat our requirement, really seriously, and it's a non-negotiable, to be done. So I was really surprised that actually there are lots of firms which manage to not do it. And when you dig a bit further, there then is very little consequence overall. So there's hardly any follow-up. So do I think much needs to change? Not necessarily. I would just like to probably see actually a little bit. I was going to say the word enforcement. I'm not. That probably has a bit of a connotation to it, but I would certainly like to see probably a bit more consequence for those that just decide they're not going to do it to start to do it, because I think that's what you guys give us in Good Business Pays. You can only report what's reported. So if it's not reported, you can't discuss it and look to improve it. So that would be the bit I'd probably like to see is a bit more sort of consequence management in there.
Tufnell's Parcels Express is interesting. They sent in the liquidators a couple of weeks ago, and we ran our numbers on how they were performing in the past few years compared to all those other companies in that sector, to find that they were not only worse than their competitors in terms of paying, but they just stopped reporting in 2020.
Right.
All of their competitors carried on reporting. DHL, Hermes, Yodel, the whole lot still report nicely, but Tufnell's stopped reporting in 2020. And in my books, that's when the nose started to dive, and we pulled out the black box to find that afterwards. So I absolutely think reporting is important. It was made statutory duty in 2017, and when something is the law, it's either important or it isn't important. So we should either enforce it or get rid of it.
Yeah. So I 100% agree, and probably the personal learning for me where I started to see almost your example there was if I go back to Carillion. So Carillion used to be a supplier to Natwest. We actually exited that relationship just before they went bust, so we had no issue from that perspective. But in the year or two before we took that decision, the sorts of red flags we were monitoring that led us to exit it were payment performance. So we could see actually, whilst we were paying Carillion very fast, not quite as fast as we are now, but well within the 30 days, actually Carillion were then paying their suppliers in somewhere between sort of 120 and 140 days. So probably didn't quite at the time connect the dots, I would say, early enough. That's why I'd say it's a bit of a learning for me personally at the time, that sort of shows why it became more important. But when you got to the end, you look back and you could actually see this was in reality quite a big red flag over the health of that supplier overall. So that they were deliberately doing that to manage their cash flow, where they had significant issues, and the rest, as they say, is history. So I agree that I suspect in many cases slow payment or late payment is perhaps an indicator of health overall, and it's something therefore we monitor much more closely. And the other thing with Korea, and I sort of touched on it earlier, we also got the stories through our business banking team as well, because again, many of their subcontractors were also our customers. So again, we could see not just what Carillion were telling us, but actually what was happening in reality, and the impact on what in many cases were quite small suppliers, electricians, builders, etc. Small businesses, family firms, etc., who subcontracted to as part of Carillion, that they weren't getting paid for 3 or 4 months at a time, which for them, was driving them to the wall.
Yes, absolutely. The source data, by the way, for you and John and anyone else watching this, for the statistic around what percentage of companies actually bother to report. So it should be around 10,000 companies that report according to Bayes, their own data, and depends on whether you listen to BDO or EY. BDO say that roughly half of the companies, I think they say around 5,000 companies are reporting. EY a little bit less than that, So yeah, you're definitely, seeing half the companies should be reporting now only bothering, and that's gone down by 25% since 2017 when the regulations were introduced, which suggests that, people are just not bothering, and they've continued not to bother in greater amounts over the past 4 years, partly because it's probably a lot of work to do, and partly because nobody's been looking at it. Well, we are now, I guess.
Yeah.
So, John, number one, thank you very much for all this time that you've given us, 40 minutes here of richness in this interview. But have you got, in parting, advice for other professionals, leadership professionals, either in procurement or change or on boards, that aspire to the kind of things that you've introduced at the Natwest Group over the years? What would your top 3 things they have to think about be?
So I think firstly you need to, I think, understand why it's important. Go and talk to some of the suppliers, see the impact it means to them of not being paid, particularly your small suppliers, where they might be living more hand to mouth overall in terms of the work they do, needing payment quite quickly. So I think firstly, just go and see how it feels. Once you do that, hopefully that then creates the sort of motivation to do something about it. So I think after that, the reason it's become embedded here is because it's not just process and systems, but actually people in my team have objectives set around it as well that we can measure. And the good thing is it is very measurable. It's quite often we receive business objectives which can be quite intangible. This is very tangible. So you almost then create the complete sort of set then of both systems, processes, objectives, reporting, etc. So there then becomes nowhere to hide overall on it. So I think sort of look at it in that way, and I think as executives be prepared to lean in to get that ball rolling in that direction, because it does require sometimes some heavy pushing to make it happen. And again, as I've said, that's not because people don't often value it. It's because, like many organizations, there's a list of priorities as long as your arm, and it's really making sure these things are up near the top of those priorities rather than down the bottom. And I think it's easy for them to go down to the bottom. So it helps to have your senior leaders bought into it. I've been lucky enough with that, and the first iteration of the supplier charter we did actually was signed by Alison Rose, which is sort of a clear demonstration of the value she put on it as well. So really you need your top to bottom systems in place that everyone supports it.
Well, John, thank you very much. A job well done today, and a job very well done at the Natwest Group. Thank you on behalf of all of the suppliers of your organisation and the small businesses in the UK. And we look forward to seeing what you're going to be doing next in the coming months and years. But for now, thank you very much.
Thank you, Terry.